This meeting is being recorded.
All right. So tonight, as we dig into Mark chapter 8, remember that we're in this section of the gospel. So we've been following Jesus through several journeys as he's been healing and he's been teaching, and people have been impressed with his authority and his miracle working ability. We saw that he then brings disciples around him, and he gives them a mission to go out and to do what he has been doing. And he sends them out to cast out demons and to minister to the sick. And so they do that. They return to Jesus, and then we see that he was involved in the miracle of feeding 5,000. And then as he continues that trajectory, he gets into discussion in chapter 7. He had a discussion with the Pharisees over, maybe not a discussion, an argument, we could say, with the Pharisees over the tradition of the elders. And Jesus basically, through that discussion and the aftermath of that, in teaching opportunities with his disciples, declares that all food is clean. He changes kind of the definition of what ritual impurity means, that it's no longer really has to do with how we handle food or don't handle food, but it's how we act in a moral way towards others in particular. We see him continue miracles as he heals a Syrophoenician woman's daughter, and that one is significant because of the interchange between Jesus and the woman over her status as a Gentile in particular. And Jesus heals her daughter and of the demonic unclean spirit that she has. And then he cures a deaf man and a mute man, and he is able to have his ears open and his tongue released, also likely in Gentile territory. And so that's where we left off in chapter 7. And tonight we'll dig in then into chapter 8 and we'll read the first 9 verses. Someone like to read that section for us, please?
I can.
Thanks, Martha.
The multitude very great, and Jesus called his disciples to him and said to them, I have compassion on the multitude, because they have now been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their houses, they will faint on the way, for some of them have come from afar. Then his disciples answered him, How can one satisfy these people with bread here in the wilderness? He asked them, How many loaves do you have? And they said, 7. And he commanded the multitude to sit down on the ground. And he took the 7 loaves and gave thanks and broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before them. And they set them before the multitude. And they had a few small fish, and having blessed them, he said to set them also before them. So they ate and were filled, and they took up 7 large baskets of leftover fragments. Now those who had eaten were about 4,000, and he sent them away.
Thank you. So this passage begins in those days, which would draw us back that this is in the same time that he has been working the miracles, the Syrophoenician woman and the healing of the man with the deafness and the inability to speak. And so he's done in the region of the Decapolis. So why is that significant, that he is in that region and it's in those days while he is just coming off the time of doing those miracles?
The message is to more than just the Hebrew people. It is to everyone, to all of them.
That would be the key thing here, is that this is in Gentile territory. So this is the fact that this is a message that goes beyond the borders of Jerusalem, beyond the borders of Israel, and it is going to people that are non-Israelites, and so Gentiles. And so just as he has just healed two individuals that were Gentiles, now he is involved in an area where there's Gentiles and there's this great crowd. And a common problem here is they don't have anything to eat. It says again there was a great crowd, which makes us automatically again, well, when was that before? Well, we've seen a great crowd in chapter 6, a similar situation that was set up there. We saw how Jesus had looked upon a great crowd back in chapter 6, and we see that the discussion here over what in chapter 7 also helps us to understand this, where what is clean food, what does it mean to eat, and what does it write about table fellowship. All of that's coming into play as we think about this. So Jesus, it says in chapter 6:34 that he had compassion. And here again, Jesus says specifically in 8:2, I have compassion on the crowd. Why does he have compassion on the crowd?
Because
Like they haven't had anything to eat.
Well, the first thing is that they haven't had anything to eat. So that's nothing to eat. He tells us a little bit more detail about that.
Yeah, for 3 days.
So they've been with him 3 days. And so they have been accompanying Jesus, likely accompanying him as he's been journeying through this area of ministry to the Gentiles. So they haven't, they've been traveling with him for a while and they have nothing to eat. And the fact that they've been with him is significant, I think, too, because that kind of is a mark of some sense of discipleship, that these are followers of Jesus, people that have been with the Lord. And so he's motivated by their hunger, and he doesn't want to send them away because why is he concerned about that?
They may faint
Because of the
away.
distance.
Yeah, so they might faint because of the distance. So you have both of these things that are coming into play, that they could faint because they haven't had anything to eat, and some of them have come from a great distance. And so he doesn't want to send them away to their homes with this possibility, and especially since some of them have come a very long way. This concern, so here his concern really seems a very practical concern. That differs somewhat from his concern in the earlier feeding miracle in chapter 6. Do you remember what it was that spurred his compassion in chapter 6?
Sheep without a shepherd.
Yeah, that's right. It was the sheep without a shepherd imagery that he said that we had a compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And so it seems like in chapter 6, there was this big emphasis on the sheep and shepherd imagery, and seeing Israel in a sense here, just as we did in like Psalm. There were those references to Psalm 23 and the way that Jesus even had the people set in companies of hundreds and fifties. None of those elements that were kind of specifically Jewish or Israelite elements are really present in this episode, which again, I think points to some of the fact that this is a miracle that's reaching beyond Israel. This is a Gentile miracle. And notice that Gentiles, so it says that they've come from a great distance. The word there is very close to when it talks about they've come from afar. And we think of from afar, that's the way that often they talk about those who are Gentile people, those who are far off. That's what Peter calls them when he gives a sermon in Acts chapter 2, verse 39. And we see that other places in Paul talks about the Gentiles and Ephesians, that they are those who are far off or from afar. And so that fact that they come a very long way might not just be the fact of the distance they traveled, but also hinting at their status as Gentile people. Now, this story also centers in, and the disciples really play a key role, just as they did in the other miracle that involved the feeding of the 5,000. But this one here, he kind of sets the disciples up So he tells them, I've had compassion on them. He tells them why. And what is his disciples' initial response to that?
How can they satisfy him with just bread?
How can we feed these people with bread here in the desert? So, he's kind of set the disciples up because he says, "Oh, I have compassion, and look at all these people that they don't have food, and I can't send them away without anything." And so you expect that the disciples to say, "Well, Jesus, we have this much, and maybe you could multiply it like you did earlier." But that's not what the disciples do. It's almost like they entirely have forgotten about what he did earlier, just a few chapters back, and not really that long ago. And so the fact is that they have this complete lack of understanding. When they say, "How can one feed these men with bread here in the desert?" Immediately, you just want to shout at them. Well, you just saw Jesus do that very thing. You saw him provide food in the desert, in the wilderness. So the disciples are showing here clearly that they're not getting it, and that they've learned nothing from Jesus's earlier feeding of the multitude. Then Jesus asked them a question, and the question is, "How many loaves do you have?" And their answer?
7.
7. So there's a little bit of an irony here, because you remember when Jesus sent out the disciples, he told them not to take what with them? He said, "Don't take anything, maybe a staff or something." But one of the things they weren't to take was bread. And so in a sense, it's kind of the irony here is they're not supposed to have any bread, but Jesus knows they do anyway, and ask the question. And they say, "Oh, we have 7." And they admit that they have that many. And Jesus then says, Jesus orders the crowd to sit down. So he kind of takes charge. He takes the 7 loaves. He gives thanks. Interesting in the language here, it's actually a bit more tied to kind of the communion meal and the communion liturgy that Paul will talk about later on when he talks in Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, of the word here is Eucharisto. It's the Eucharist. It's giving thanks. The word was slightly different in earlier in chapter 6, and so there's really this tie-in to kind of the Lord's table, which I think is very significant in the sense of, here we are in Gentile territory with those who are far off, and it might be Mark's way of saying the Gentiles are also welcome at the Lord's table. There's this connection there that comes out, and it certainly parallels what the Lord's table, the communion meal, as Jesus takes the bread, gives thanks, he breaks it, and he gives it to them. Now, the actual distribution, that was done by whom?
The disciples.
Disciples, which I find very hopeful here, even though the disciples are very dense and they don't get Jesus. Yet Jesus still uses them to help fulfill his ministry and to help feed the crowd. So that's a nice thing. And so once again, Jesus uses these small number of resources to administer the meal. And then the story wraps up pretty quickly. Everyone ate and they were satisfied. And then Mark draws our attention to, just as he did in the episode in chapter 6, of the leftovers. This time, how many leftovers do we have?
7 large bags.
7 baskets.
So 7 baskets. I think that's significant. Again, just as in the first meal, that means there's more food, there's abundance, there's even more to go around. In some sense, that this is Mark's way of saying this meal hasn't ended yet. There's still food for others to come and to take. And I think that's it's an important point, is that it's kind of a way of saying this table is still open. There's still room for others. And I think we had the significance of 12 in the previous one was tied to the 12 tribes of Israel. So we see really a kind of a Jewish idea there. What might be the significance of 7 here?
Completion.
Seven is as we learned in the book of Revelation, the number of completion and the number of wholeness. So it's likely that is what is here. Some try to make a connection even with the Gentile. There's the 70 nations of the Gentiles that are referenced in some other places in the New Testament, and some people suggest that that's what that connection is. I think it's more of just that perfection, that it's an abundance, and it's the perfect number that's left over. It's enough for everyone. And then Mark tells us how many were here. Were 4,000, and Mark, I think earlier was 5,000. So we have 5,000 and 4,000, still a large number. Remember that probably refers only to the men that were present, not others that might have been there with their wives or children. So any women that were there. And so this whole thing seems to be a deliberate kind of sequel or a reprise of what Jesus has done in Mark chapter 6. And I think the way that Mark sets this whole story up, we have the feeding, and we have the disciples kind of not getting Jesus. We have the Pharisees who really don't get Jesus, and Jesus, through his confrontation with the Pharisees, declares all food clean. Notice that food is like the thing that is an issue, and who has the ability to be at the table? What's unclean? What's unclean? And Jesus, through that whole confrontation with the Pharisees, declares that all food is now clean. And that means that Jesus can also bring his meal, his food, to Gentiles as well. And so he has set that up by showing us through these two feeding narratives of the multitudes that there's enough for the Jews, there's enough for the people, God's people of Israel, the covenant people, but this is also a meal that extends beyond the borders of Israel, and there's enough for everyone at the table. And the other way you could also see this is that in chapter 6, Jesus fed the children, and in chapter 8, he feeds the dogs, because remember what the woman said, even the dogs could eat the crumbs from the children's table. And here, I think, is an illustration that there's more than enough. There's enough for Jew and Gentile alike, and this is whole kind of how that's set up. And so he's fed the Gentiles, and note that this theme of the bread and the feeding is going to continue in the discussion that follows. But do you have any questions or observations in that section?
I thought that was great about the perfection and all that, about the number 7. I thought it is 7 for heaven too.
7 for heaven, that rhymes. Very nice.
Yeah, there was a children's song about that.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
I have to add, or would like to add, while Tom was still in the Air Force, we had the privilege of living in Greece, and we tried to learn some of the basic language. And the word for Thanksgiving or for thank you is Evaristo. And that I only heard that. And then I saw it written out, and it's written out what you said, the Eucharist.
Mhm.
And when making that connection, just, I don't know, very, very touched me very deeply
Yeah.
to realize it. And they use that all the time because that's part of their language. And yet for us, and for me, that was just extra special.
Yeah.
So that meal is really a Thanksgiving meal.
Yeah. Our communion meal is a Thanksgiving meal. Thank you, Jesus, for what you've done. And
Amen.
really an opportunity to give God praise and thanks. And that's why I think it's always a very special opportunity that, Christ says he'll be present as we are there to share that thanks with him. And we recall through that meal all the wonderful things he has done. So it's who he is and his acts that we celebrate.
I was taught so many prayers too, because I used to say one of my old grandma's prayers, but then somebody taught me a prayer, God is great, God is good, let us, and it went so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Let us can go for our food and so forth.
Yeah, that's Thanksgiving as well.
Yeah.
This all ties into meals and table fellowship here of Luke, sets this up in different ways. And Jesus is eating with sinners all the time and tax collectors, but the way that Mark sets it up is pretty neat, because it's this idea that what is available to the Jewish people is also now available to the Gentiles, and there's this whole change that takes place. And part of the challenge of the disciples is they don't get that, and clearly the Pharisees who challenged Jesus don't get it, and so that's part of the conflict really here in Mark's gospel. Any other questions or thoughts, observations? Well, if someone would read our next section, it's very long, verse 10.
That's it?
That's it. Yeah.
Okay, I'll do that.
Thank you.
I haven't had a chance to practice though, but you'll understand. Okay.
Yeah.
And immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and came to the region of Dalmanutha.
Okay, there you go. This just like the last time he fed people at the feeding of the 5,000, he now gets in a journey, and he immediately gets into his boat. The disciples are with him. We know the disciples are traveling. And the other thing we know is that we don't really most scholars don't know where Dalmanutha is. It is an unknown little territory or region, but most scholars do believe that this is an area that is out, taking him from Gentile territory now away from the Gentile side of the lake towards the land of Israel. And so he's coming into the land of Israel in this part. And so he's crossing back over out of Gentile territory. That's all I have to say on that one. Very deep verse. Okay, let's read verses 11 through 21. Someone would read those, please.
I will try to read.
Thank you, Jack.
And the Pharisees came forth and began to question him, seeking of him a sign from heaven, tempting him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit, and saith, Why doth this generation seek after a sign? Verily I say unto you, there shall no sign be given unto this generation. And he left them, and entering into the ship again, departed to the other side. Now the disciples had forgotten to take bread. Isn't that interesting? Now the disciples had forgotten to take bread, neither had they in the ship with them more than one loaf. And he charged them, saying, Take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, and of the leaven of Herod. And they reasoned amongst themselves, saying, It is because we have no bread. And when Jesus knew it, he saith unto them, Why reason ye because ye have no bread? Perceive ye not yet, neither understand? Have ye your heart yet hardened? Having eyes, see ye not? And having ears, hear ye not? And do ye not remember? When I break the 5 loaves among 5,000, how many baskets full of fragments took ye up? And they say unto him, 12. And when the 7 among 4,000, how many baskets full of fragments took ye up? And they said, 7. And he said unto them, How is it that ye do not understand?
Thank you. So this conflict here, so we have again the Pharisees, who were the debate challengers in chapter 7 as well, and the Pharisees appear without introduction. Why do they come into the scene for?
On
a sign.
They're seeking a sign, but their motive here isn't they want a sign because they're curious about Jesus and they want to know, is he really, this interesting teacher, or is Jesus have this great authority? Maybe he's someone special or prophet. They don't want to know any of that. Why do they want the sign?
They're testing him.
Yeah, that word test or tempt, I think Test is in several translations. I think the translation Jack read said tempt, which is significant because that is the same word that was used in chapter 1, verse 13, when Satan tested or tempted Jesus in the wilderness. Wow, the Pharisees here are kind of putting themselves in league with Satan. But that's not something, that's a surprise because, well, they're already conspiring to kill Jesus, and they already accused Jesus of having, the spirit of Beelzebub and the spirit of Satan in him. So, hey, they're in league with Satan. It seems to be a way of saying that. And so they asked for this sign from heaven. And Jesus's first reaction is not a verbal reaction. What is it?
He sighed.
Sighed. Yeah, you get this sense of exasperation, of deep kind of disappointment. Here we go again, kind of idea with the disciples. And so that's a deep sigh, it says. And after that deep sigh, he then asked a question. And how does he refer to the Pharisees?
A generation.
Generation.
Yeah, this generation. So that's an interesting way to speak about it, is why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly, I tell you, no sign will be given to this generation. This generation, of course, is focusing on this existing generation, the one that is here in front of Jesus. But there's another significance to that. And if you look in the Old Testament, this generation occurs in times of judgment, and particularly is associated with Genesis chapter 7, which is the story of Noah and sinful humanity, who at that time was called this generation. That this generation then is wicked humanity, sinful humanity that is opposed to God. And so that was the generation that was wiped out by the flood. And here the Pharisees are called this generation. So the other irony of them seeking a sign is they've already seen Jesus do a lot of things. Jesus has healed individuals right in front of them. He has certainly word about his miracles of feeding the multitudes. Certainly that's gotten out. They have seen him drive out demons. So they already have seen the miracles. So this is not just an honest inquiry to get Jesus to do something. Clearly, they are trying to trap, in a sense, Jesus. And that trap is not a trap that Jesus is wanting to go into. The Pharisees have made it very clear so far in this story that they don't want to accept that the presence of God, the kingdom of God, has broken in the person of Jesus. So, a lot of other people have come to Jesus for help. They've come to Jesus for healing. But the Pharisees, they don't see God's sign. They don't believe in Jesus or his ministry. So here, Jesus is clear. They don't have a sign. And so Jesus leaves them. Just says he left them. He got into the boat again, and he went to the other side. So Jesus again continues his boat journey. So the Pharisees' inability to see and accept what God is doing has been set. And that sets the stage for this encounter then between Jesus and his disciples. So the first thing that Mark tells us about the disciples is what?
They didn't have more than they'd forgotten to take bread.
They'd forgotten bread. So in one sense, it's kind of funny because it says that they didn't have any bread, but oh yeah, they do have one loaf. But it's kind of like saying, well, we have just this one little loaf. We should have planned and brought more, in a sense, is the idea here. And so they've forgotten to bring bread. And of course, immediately when we see the word bread, we're thinking about those miracles that Jesus just did with the bread. And on both occasions, they had food. And this bread theme. What can you believe that the disciples are concerned about having one loaf? I mean, here they are, a small group, right? 12, and Jesus just fed 5,000 people and 4,000 people with 12 loaves and 7 loaves. I'm sorry, 5 loaves and 7 loaves. So if Jesus could feed that crowd with that many loaves, certainly he can take care of the disciples. So their whole concern about this is kind of misguided, clearly. But Jesus responds to them with what words?
Take heed, beware.
Take heed and beware, watch out. And the bread theme continues, and he talks about the leaven. Some translations will have yeast, and the yeast of the Pharisees and the Herodians in some translations, or Herod in others. And so this is what he watches them and is warning them to be on guard against. The bread of the Pharisees and the Herodians or Herod was why is that bread to be watching out for?
The people and the honor of God.
They don't honor God.
I said to the people and honor of God.
Yeah, they're called to honor God. But what is it about the Pharisees and the Herodians?
They're corrupt.
Because the bread has leaven in it, as
They're
opposed
corrupt.
to being unleavened.
11. What is the point of the leaven metaphor here?
Represents
Make it
sin.
rise.
There's a sin metaphor. Mary Jane, you said something.
And leaven would be to make the bread rise.
So yeah, on a practical level, right? Leaven makes bread rise. And what happens is you take a little bit of that, right? And then it infects the whole. And Susan is right too, that this is a metaphor that is in some cases used. It can be used as a positive metaphor in some places, but it's also a negative metaphor in many places in the scripture. And in those negative metaphor instances, it is the yeast that is representing sin. And so a little bit can come in, and then it goes throughout the whole in order to make it rise. And that little part infects the whole. That's kind of what the metaphor is. And so beware of that leaven, that sin of the Pharisees and the Herodians. And what their sin is here in the Gospel of Mark, their sin has been that they are opposed to the kingdom, that they're unable to see that the kingdom is present in Jesus. And that's what they have been throughout. Their priorities are not kingdom priorities. In fact, they are hostile against the kingdom. And the Herodians, if you remember, the Herodians and the Pharisees have already plotted together in chapter 3 to kill Jesus. And if you take that's if you take it as the Herodians. If you take it as Herod, again, you have someone who is opposed to the work of God. He's killed John the Baptist, and his priorities are not kingdom priorities because he is preoccupied with his own priorities. And so this is a matter of this yeast that can infect the whole. And so Jesus is telling them, watch out. Don't be like those Pharisees. Don't be like the Herodians, because they don't accept who I am. They don't accept the kingdom at work in me. And so that's what they are called to beware of. There's also a sense in which, and we're going to see that play out in the remainder of Mark's gospel, part of the sin of the Pharisees and the Herodians is that their concern and their way that they lead is by self-promotion and self-advancement. They don't look out for others. They don't serve others. They're all about themselves. And that sense of self-focus is also something that Mark's going to actually demonstrate as Jesus will continue to teach the disciples on their journey. And so I think there's part of that is that leaven as well. And so the disciples then say, in response to what Jesus said, they're like, oh, that's because we have no bread.
Still don't get it.
These guys are pretty dense. All right. So they're unable to make the link. They're unable to understand what Jesus is talking about. And evidently don't remember what Jesus did earlier. And so they are focused on their lack of bread still. The lack of bread is the least of their problems. And they're ignoring Jesus's warning about the leaven of the Pharisees and leaven of the Herodians. And so Jesus, I think Jesus gets a little bit, we don't always know the tone when Jesus talks, but I think he's a little bit maybe exasperated again here. And he says, why are you talking about having no bread? It's like, come on, guys. Why do you keep having this conversation? And then do you still not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? And do you not remember? So all these different ways that he is reiterating their failure to comprehend. And all of that lack of understanding, lack of perception, that comes, it's very much prophetic language that is used in the words of Jeremiah chapter 5 and Ezekiel. And all this is alluding to the fact that the disciples are in a sense blind, they're deaf, and not literally, but on a spiritual level, that they have failed to have and understand the nature of the kingdom. In fact, their hardness of heart, well, they're awful a lot like the Pharisees, who also felt to get it. So you see how Mark set this up with, here's the Pharisees, and then Jesus warns the disciples about the bread of the Pharisees, and then the disciples are, well, they're just like the Pharisees almost. Wow. It's kind of, the disciples in Mark's gospel are not heroes, are they? And so they should know better, but they don't. And so none of what Jesus is doing, none of the works that they have seen has really helped them to understand the nature of the kingdom. And their need to overcome this blindness is going to play a key role as we go forward. So Jesus then interrogates them. They don't remember anything that he's done. And so he has to bring it to their minds. And so he asked, the two questions are about how much was left over. And they tell him the answers. In the first one of 5,000, it was 12. And in the second one for the 4,000, there were 7 left over. And that's what they should remember. That's what they should be focused on instead of their lack of bread. And they don't. And so because they don't get it, they are dangerously close to the agenda of the Pharisees, who had argued and tested Jesus. They've seen Jesus's presence manifested in God's presence manifested through Jesus and 2 huge bread miracles and the leftovers that are available to Jews and Gentiles, but they worry over their own lack of bread. And so Jesus' stinging question to them at the end is, do you not yet understand? Do you not yet get it? And what they should be getting is what Jesus would want them to get, is the fact that he is able to supply their needs, and he's able to supply the needs not just of them, but of all people. And the disciples, he told them earlier in this gospel, remember right before he's told them to go, and they're called to go and feed and to provide food for those who, in both of those healing miracles, they're the ones that you give them something to eat. And then that sets, that plays out that Jesus has called them to take and to feed the hungry from their table. And in both miracles, they were the ones that were responsible to distribute the food. And they are called to continue to go and to feed others. And those 2 bread miracles set within the context of their mission out to the world, and Jesus's rejection of table practices and his presence among the Gentiles should point them out in mission to the world, but they don't get it, and they fail to understand that, and as a result, their hearts are hardened, and they basically want people to look after themselves instead of them looking to help them and have compassion as Jesus did. And so that whole juxtaposition of the Pharisees and then the disciples helps us as readers to see the disciples' assimilation of those characteristics of those who oppose Jesus. The disciples are running the risk of seduction by the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of the Herodians. And we then, as readers, are asked, what about us? Are we also being seduced by the leaven of the Pharisees and the Herodians? Are we failing to see how God's kingdom is at work and how we're part of that kingdom? Are we failing to remember? We're called to ask ourselves, do we remember? We're called to ask ourselves, do we yet understand? But there is hope in that passage, right? He says to them, do you not yet understand? That word yet, there's a helpful word, because that means there's still a little hope for these disciples, that maybe the possibility is there that they'll come to understanding. Questions about this interaction, the two interactions, in fact, of Jesus with the Pharisees and then Jesus with his disciples.
I had a reaction to the demand of the Pharisees for the sign. It just seems to be upside down to me. We're anticipating the Messiah, but we're anticipating a particular kind of Messiah that will turn everything over and put Israel on top again, throw out the Romans and so on. And so it's like, okay, so if you're that guy, you can do this. But because you can't do it, then you're not the Messiah, and now we got you. That kind of thing.
Absolutely. And I think if you think about that, part of what the misunderstanding and part of the leaven of the Pharisees is their expectation of the Messiah who's like this. And Mark's gospel is being very intentional of pointing to the fact that Jesus isn't the kind of Messiah that was expected. I think that's why Jesus in all these miracles tells people not to tell. It's because he knows that their understanding of what the Messiah is completely contrary to the nature of the kingdom of God. And the only way that they'll fully understand is by seeing him go through his journey to Jerusalem, his passion, and ultimately his death. That's the way in which the kingdom comes. And that's not what they saw as a Messiah at all. And I think the misguidedness of the Pharisees there is indication of that. And that the disciples themselves, and they're going to show, as they interact with Jesus as he's on his journey to Jerusalem, they're going to show that their nature and understanding of the kingdom and their nature and understanding of the Messiah is also about, this world on top and being on top and overthrowing the Romans, and how different Jesus is, because here he is having compassion on the Gentiles. That's not the expectation of the Messiah. Any other thoughts or questions there? I hope you're seeing throughout this, and I don't know that I realized too how much Mark really is very intentional in the way that he's structured his gospel. So often we read stories in the gospels in isolation, but when you're following the way that Mark tells the story, it's amazing. Because I've preached on the feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000, and when you're just kind of preaching on it here and there, you can't make those same connections. But when you're reading that all together, the way that when you compare those two and you understand that this is about Jesus reaching out to the Jews and then the Gentiles, it totally changes the way in which we understand what Jesus is all about in this gospel.
I could picture it all together and put it together as you say it when you read the book.
Yeah.
And I knew when I was in the Lutheran church, they read that in Bible school, but they never let me anticipate then.
Yeah. So let's read verses 22 to 26.
I'll read it.
Thank you.
They arrived at Bethesda,
There the people brought a blind man to Jesus and begged him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. Then he spat on his eyes, laid his hands upon them, and asked whether he could see anything. The man's sight began to come back, and he said, I see people. They look like trees, but they are walking about. Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again. He looked hard, and now he was cured and could see everything clearly. Then Jesus sent him home, saying, do not even go into the village.
Thanks, Helen. So the boat trip concludes. They come to Bethsaida, and there are some people. It just says some people who bring a blind man. We see that a lot in a lot of the miracles in Mark's gospel, that someone brings someone else to Jesus. And you think of the paralyzed man, and his friends bought him. And we've seen that with a couple of the other miracles. But here they lead a blind man, and they beg Jesus to touch the blind man. And so Jesus, it's interesting, as he takes the man away. Why do you think he takes him away?
I think the one reason is he took it away to healing, and then, I don't know if that's true, but yeah, he also made it took it away because I forget the word, but yeah, like say he was the healing.
Yeah, so he does take him away to heal him. Why
He
would
doesn't want a crowd around.
This is probably some of that idea, right? Of the way in which Jesus is not wanting the false expectations of the Messiah to influence the way in which he's seen. And so I think this is part of that idea that Jesus doesn't want word out about him yet, in that sense. I think there is some of that. And so Jesus takes him by the hand and leads him. And so this man who needs help being led forward because he can't see. And then Jesus does interesting actions. And we've the saliva. So he puts saliva. Your Helen's version was very it actually put it slightly different. Mine was, I had the idea more like he would spit in his hand and then put the saliva, but Helen's had the idea that he actually spit in the eye. I'll have to look at that to kind of.
That's what mine says.
Yeah,
He had spit on his eyes.
Yeah, so I have to look at that to see some of the ways that the translations take that, because mine says that he put saliva. So whichever way, it's a little more more interesting if he's actually spitting in the eye, isn't it? But anyway, he lays hands on him. So he does these two actions. And then Jesus says, can you see anything? And what's the man say?
I see men like trees walking.
Yeah. So he basically says, I can see people, but not really very clearly. That's kind of the indication. They just look like trees. Now, it doesn't say this guy was blind from birth, because my first question was, how does he know what a tree looks like? But or a man, but maybe he wasn't always blind and he knew those things. So he's able to just tell that. But it's curious that Jesus, he's touched him and he's spat in his eye, or he put saliva on his eye, and yet the miracle doesn't seem to be complete.
Yeah, my grandma's person said it was blind altogether, but yeah, I think that's true. He might have been half blind.
Well, that would be a way to describe his state at this point. He can see, but it's not full, it's partial. So that's what we have. And so then Jesus, it says, laid his hands on him again, on his eyes again. And then he gets this, the man looks intently at him. So when Jesus lays his hands, he gets this intense gaze from the man. And then his sight was restored and he saw everything. And then Mark emphasizes it. He saw everything clearly.
Because I can remember, go ahead.
So this is a journey then from no sight to partial sight to full sight. Now, it's interesting. You could read commentaries that will say, oh, this shows Jesus's lack of power. He wasn't able to do anything because of the faith. But I think that Jesus in this miracle, and particularly the way Mark tells it, is actually showing us through this miracle something about the disciples. And I think we're going to see, if you look and this healing of this blind man is actually bookended with another healing of a blind man in chapter 10. Jesus heals blind Bartimaeus, and so we have at the beginning kind of this next section, and at the end of this whole section, which is about discipleship, we have a healing here at the beginning of blindness, and at the end we have this healing of blindness. But because of this two-stage healing, I think what Jesus is showing us is, remember, what did he just, one of the things he just accused his disciples of in the narrative we just read, in his interaction in the boat,
Was the bread?
right, about the bread. But one of the things he says is, do you have eyes and fail to see? In other words, you're blind. Of course, he's talking spiritually blind.
Yeah.
And so I think he's taking, and this person that is now actually a physically blind person is giving us insight into the disciples. This passage is looking back to the blindness of the disciples and forward, I think, to the sight that will ultimately be revealed to him. And I think it's saying there's hope for the disciples, that they can still move from the blindness of their unbelief into true sight, but that it is going to be a process. They don't see, and then they're going to see partially, and then they're going to see fully. When will they see fully? The cross. That will be the full revelation of who Jesus is, and when they will finally grasp it. But this miracle, I think, is a paradigm of that possibility, that they are going from blindness to partial sight to full sight. There's hope for the disciples.
Letter of Paul, we will see clearly. Now we see as through a glass darkly.
Yep. You think about that same seeing metaphor in Corinthians. I think that might be 1 Corinthians 13.
Something that struck us here in this story of the blind man being healed is, it doesn't mention he was healed because of his faith.
Yeah, interesting observation. Faith isn't an element here. So faith isn't the element here. It seems like there's something else that's driving Mark to include this.
But it does show the faith of the people who brought him to get healed.
Yeah, clearly there is some faith here. And I think that that just because Mark doesn't emphasize it doesn't mean that there isn't faith even on the man's part. I think the reason Mark probably doesn't mention it is there's a different purpose for this miracle at this point. Earlier, he was making point about faith and lack of faith. And now the point is a point about the nature of blindness and the way in which the revelation of the kingdom comes. Good observations. Any other observations or questions?
In the Living Bible, it says he said that he could. It looked like tree trunks walking around.
That gives a funny image now. Yeah.
Tree trunks.
Yep. See those tree chunks walking around. So they sent Jesus sends the guy away and sends him home and says, don't even go into the village, which is, you think about, that's probably one of those sense of which this is that kind of not telling, when he tells the others after being healed not to tell anyone or to be quiet about the miracle. This is the sense in which that is taking place. So let's wrap up with verses 27 through 30. And this section, would someone read those 4 verses, actually?
I can read it.
Thanks.
Now, Jesus and his disciples went out to the towns of Caesarea Philippi, and on the road he asked his disciples, saying to them, "Who do men say that I am?" And they answered, "John the Baptist, but some say Elijah, and others one of the prophets." And he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered and said to him, "You are the Christ." Then he charged them that they should tell no one about him.
Thank you. So Jesus is with his disciples up in the north in Caesarea Philippi, and it says he is on the way. That's going to be a significant phrase in this portion of the gospel, because Jesus is seen as he's being on a journey, and it's on the way. We're going to see that phrase a couple times. And so while on the way, he asked them, "Who do people say that I am?" And they give him various answers. The kind of what's the public opinion out there? John the Baptist, and some say Elijah, and still others say you're one of the prophets. Well, all those are significant. John the Baptist, Elijah, and the prophets are all seen as in some place having a role of a precursor or a forerunner to the Messiah, to the Messianic kingdom, or to the kind of the final kingdom of God. And so, John the Baptist, as Christians, we know him as the one who prepares the way for Jesus. Elijah, the speculation was that he would return to bring in the Messianic era from Malachi chapter 4. And prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah, or there was a prophet like Moses who would arise again. All of these were seen to be those who would usher in the final age. And so all of that is pointing out to the fact that they see that Jesus is one of these prophets. That's the public opinion poll. By the way, these are also the opinions that were shared back when Herod was kind of talking about who he might be. And Herod himself, he had his own opinion. He said he's John the Baptist raised from the dead, and has come back to haunt him. But all of those have those understanding. And then Jesus turns to the disciples and says, he kind of centers it in. But what about you? Who do you say that I am? We've heard what others think. And Peter speaks up. And Peter says, what?
You are the Christ.
You are the Messiah.
You are the Christ or the Messiah. So those two words both mean the same thing. Jesus Christ is not Jesus' last name. It means Jesus the Messiah. And so when Jesus Christ, the anointed one, that he is the anointed one. And wow, what a confession. This is exciting. And then what does Jesus do?
Tell them not to tell anyone about him.
Yep. Yeah, don't tell anyone. And it's not just like, hey, it's a stern warning. He doesn't want anyone to find out. Again, I think this is because the misunderstanding of the nature of what it means to be the Messiah. So this is a big turning point in the gospel. This is a key passage because from here on out, Jesus is going to be on that journey to the cross. And this turning point is significant. Now, as readers of the gospel, we already know who Jesus is. We were told at the very beginning in chapter 1 that Jesus is the Christ. We're told that he's the Son of God. And we're told all that. But those who are characters in the story, they don't know. And this is the first time that it's kind of been put out there. And they have this idea. And I want you to think about this in the sense of the movement from blindness to sight that we just saw in that last story. That just as the blind man was healed, and it was a partial healing at first and then a full healing, I think that Peter is here correct. He has the correct idea that Jesus Christ is the Messiah. But like the blind man, I think he only gets it partially because his eyes are not fully open to the truth about Jesus yet. They're not fully open to the deeper mystery of what the messianic status of Jesus really means. And I think that won't yet come to full sight. He won't yet see everything clearly as we said, until Jesus goes to the cross. And so I think this is that next step. The disciples have shown they're blind, and now, ooh, they're starting to get it. They understand this thing about Jesus, and they're correct, but they're not fully correct in their understanding of what that means. And that's going to be what Jesus teaches them about now, and what they will fully come to know as Jesus continues his journey and gives his life on the cross. And so he commands the disciples to silence. And then, as we'll see next week when we pick it up, Jesus immediately begins to take them to the next level. He begins to try to help them to go from that partial sight to full sight, as he begins to announce his passion and what that is going to mean, and what discipleship means, and what being the Messiah means. And he's going to play all that out. And so this is Mark showing us that the disciples are starting to make that journey. Maybe they're not as hard-hearted as they've always shown themselves to be. Maybe they're starting to see a little bit, and maybe one day they will see clearly. Questions, observations, or other comments?
I think it's in John where he adds that that Peter could only have done that or said that because the Father had informed him. And I was wondering, is this just because Mark is a shorter and more concise in what he writes, or just curious?
Yeah, I'm not positive either, because I think that is an interaction when Jesus says that you can only know this because the Father revealed it to you, and that is very much in John. And here it is more of Mark's not focusing on that, and I don't know why, other than they're both kind of doing different things with the story in their overall picture of their gospel. Whereas knowledge is very important in John's gospel, and that knowledge that comes from the Father, because Jesus is the one who is sent from the Father, who communes with the Father and brings us in touch with the Father. And so I think that's what John's doing. I can't say why Mark doesn't bring that in, other than I think what you said about his conciseness. Mark brings the bare bones to make the point that he wants to make, and I think that's what's happening here.
When I was a boy, my favorite gospel was Luke, and that I think related to an interest in history. And Luke was somewhat historical in the way he wrote his story. When I got older, I appreciated Mark, not for what I've learned now, but because it was such a simple. I thought it was such a simple story. He just tells the story of Jesus' ministry, and the good news. But because we're in this class, I am now amazed at how deep Mark's story is, and the allusions and references to the Old Testament, the prayer text. It really is exciting. It's something really worth studying. Thank you.
No, thank you. No, I think Mark is really a good writer in the way that he does this, and certainly inspired by the Spirit. But the way in which he sets this whole story of Jesus up, it's not just kind of the facts, but he's doing more than that. He's ministering to the people that his time with what does Jesus mean for us? What does it mean to truly be what does it mean for Jesus to be the Messiah, first of all, and then what does it mean for us to be his disciple? And he does it in a really pretty impressive way. And it's neat to look at all four of the Gospels have kind of these great ways that they do it, and they do it in different ways, and they all have different gifts that they bring to that. And like you said, Luke is the researcher and historian, and that's where he does a great job, and he does that in 2 volumes for us. And then Matthew really focused on kind of the Jewish nature of that. And then John does this whole other thing that's really impressive. But all of it to help us to gain this insight into who Jesus is, and not only who Jesus is, but what's expected of us as his disciples.
I like Mark, and then I like how he set it up in between John.
Yeah. Yeah, John is a good one too. Any other thoughts? So we'll pick it up on 831. This is a kind of a significant portion as we'll go into this middle section of the gospel. What we just saw was a big turning point. This is the center of the gospel, and we're going to see how it continues as we go forth from here.
I was gonna say Mark between John. Mark really puts it together.